Hello, welcome to the Deep 404. I would just first of all like to start with a correction. Thank you. Someone commented on my last video where I mistakenly said that Norway had joined NATO this year. It was Finland that I was referring to. Norway joined NATO in 1949. So thank you. I will make corrections if I've made mistakes, if people catch them or if I become aware of them myself. Now, the title for this video, has Russia just won this war? It's very possible, as we've all known for a long time, the key to Ukraine being able to be successful in this conflict is continued Western funding. And they've hit a major hurdle in obtaining more US funding this week. So after a period of time of Republicans, so in the US Senate and House of Representatives, in the US, Republicans, some supporting further funding for Ukraine, some not. It seems that 2 days ago there has been an alignment of the Republican senators, and they have rejected to approve a funding bill for the Biden administration. Now, this funding bill would have seen approximately $60 billion more go to Ukraine for the conflict that they're in. As it stands, this is not being approved at this stage. Now, there was an emergency meeting a couple of days ago for senators. Apparently, there was it was quite a heated meeting. There was some yelling between Democratic and Republican senators. The Democratic senators, led by Chuck Schumer, wanted to keep the discussions firmly focused on providing more money to Ukraine. The Republicans are saying, hang on, first of all, we want to know what this money is going for. Like, things are looking bad. What is the point here? We want a bit of governance over this. We want to know where this money is being spent. What's happened to this $100 billion we've already given? But most importantly, and this is a clever political play by Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, to set this up, I think. They have said to the Democrats that if you want us to approve this, then we need to see from the Biden administration some real movement on the problems, the challenges that we have at the southern border with Mexico. Now, the southern border of Mexico, at the moment, it's estimated there are 10,000 undocumented or illegal immigrants crossing the border from Mexico into America every day. There's 10,000 people a day, so 3.5 million a year, turning up through what is undocumented immigration. Now, you may have varying opinions on immigration and what should happen here, but I think most people could consider a nation wishing to have some control over its immigration, wanting to be able to vet the people that come into its country. This is not what's happening on the southern border at the moment. The southern border, people are just coming in. Now, they're not just coming from Mexico. They are entering via Mexico, but they are coming from everywhere. So this concern that the Republicans have about the porous or non-existent border with Mexico has now been tied to funding for Ukraine, and more interestingly, even funding for Israel. So in order for the Biden administration to get their funding to be able to give $60 billion more to Ukraine, and to give about $16 billion to Israel, the Republicans are now pushing back and saying, this could happen. We're not against, we're not morally against funding these requests, but we need to see real action and change on the border. Now, the border is a problem for Biden. Biden has said that by not funding this for Ukraine, the Republicans are in effect giving a gift to Putin. Lloyd Austin has come out in an interesting interview and has effectively threatened Republican lawmakers with the fact that he will send their sons, brothers, fathers to war. John Kirby, spokesman for the White House, has come out and talked about American blood being shed if this funding isn't given to Ukraine. So they're really cranking up all the old tropes and levers here to say US sons will be killed if we don't get the funding for Ukraine. Now, that's another topic to talk about. We might get to that a little bit later on as to whether the US would actually ever commit any of its troops to Ukraine. But right now, the Democrats are using that as a lever to try to get the Republicans to agree. So Biden is in a tricky spot here. It is a well-known policy of the Democratic Party, and this is why there was such opposition to Trump's idea of building a wall. It's a well-known policy, and the policy relates to the fact that the Democrats believe that if they have a porous border with Mexico, if they allow illegal immigrants in, or undocumented people into the country, and then provide them sort of social security or allow them to find an easy way to citizenship, their assumption is those people will become Democratic voters. And so for the Democratic Party, having an open border where 3.5 million people a year are allowed in, now in the media, everyone who's in Mexico who's looking at this is seeing Democrats wanting to let us in, Republicans not wanting to let us in, wanting to build a wall. You can see how this works. So Biden is now in a bind because if he says, okay, we will change our policy on the immigration with the Mexican border, they lose one of the biggest tools they have for gaining future Democratic voters. And this is not something that they'll give up lightly. This is something which is opposed by Democratic senators and by Democratic House representatives. In principle, most Democrats, politicians, oppose this concept of actually making a border wall because they know that they lose this opportunity for so many new Democratic voters. Now, Dick Durbin, Democratic senator, has actually come out this week and said he'd like to support a bill by another one of his lawmakers that they would introduce, which would say if you are an undocumented migrant into the United States, or as their term, an illegal immigrant, because you've entered the country illegally, you haven't followed the processes of the United States to gain your residency, you can sign up for the armed forces. And as long as you pass the health checks and a background check and you serve, we will give you citizenship. So now Dick Durbin has said something which I think he may live to regret, because in his drive to convince Republicans that they should, and the general public, that they should support this and they should support him when he supports this bill to allow undocumented migrants to join the American military and then receive citizenship. I'll just quote him. He says, "Do you know what the recruiting numbers are at the Army, the Navy and the Air Force? They can't reach their quotas each month. They can't find enough people to join." And so this is why he's suggesting, we should use these undocumented people in the country, allow them to join the military. But I think you can begin to see, you can take a cynical look at this and see how this means that you could, in effect, say, all right, the millions of undocumented people, go to the local military recruiting office. We could really relax the background checks, let you join the military, you serve for a period of time, and then you become American citizens. Now, a drive like that might see millions of people receive citizenship in the next couple of years. Perhaps, depending on how quickly this bill were passed, if it were passed, you might see millions of people receive their citizenship before November 2024. And if that is the case, you can see why the Democrats want to do this. One does question just on what scale this might be done and just how good these background checks might be, because you could imagine that people with bad actors, nefarious ideas might say, wow, what a wonderful way for us to insert people into the American military. For what purpose? You could speculate. Might be in order to gather information about the operation of the American military, gather operation about current ongoings and planned military exercises and operations. All of that could be fed back by back channels to your enemies, in effect. It's a possibility. So this lack of funding for Ukraine and for Israel isn't something that won't ever happen. Not necessarily, but there are some factors here, particularly with Ukraine. And I'll get to a little bit on the battlefront a little bit later on. All across the front line, the Ukrainians are suffering and are losing ground and are being pushed back. From Kupiansk in the north, down through Krasny Liman, into the Donetsk region and South Donetsk and Zaporozhye, and down to Kherson. In all areas, the Ukrainians are taking a beating. They are just outgunned in terms of artillery, in terms of numbers of men, in terms of the number of drones, and in terms of the amount of ammunition in those pieces of artillery. And on top of that, they're outgunned in terms of air capability, air power, and jets, fighters, and helicopters. Areas that took months for the Ukrainians to capture in the offensive started in June around Kleshchevka and Andriivka, south of Bakhmut. Andriivka, the Ukrainians have now been pushed out. In Kleshchevka, reports from yesterday are that the Russians have now claimed the high ground on the northern area of Kleshchevka, which gives them a superiority and an ability to now wage war upon the rest of Kleshchevka. There's reporting from some Twitter and Telegram channels that there is a whole pocket around Kleshchevka which is now at risk of falling. To the west of Bakhmut, north of Kleshchevka, to the west of Bakhmut, in Kromovo, the area around there, again, losses for the Ukrainians. All across the line, the Ukrainians are struggling, and the Russians are, if not on the offensive yet, they are taking serious tactical gains. Over the last couple of weeks, the gains that we are talking about are being measured now in the hundreds of meters or kilometer, like a kilometer has been taken. Now, these are big gains when you consider that what they're pushing up against now in their areas like Avdiivka, with the coke plant and the fighting around there. This is a township and an industrial area that has been fortified since 2014. There's been 8 or 9 years Ukraine has been fortifying this, and the fortifications are solid. I saw some video footage of Ukrainian trenches being sunk into the ground. Now, these trenches weren't dug into the ground. Well, they were dug. The channel to accommodate these trenches was dug with heavy equipment. What was being laid down were modular concrete sections of trench, things which looked to be about 2.8 meters high, a meter and a half wide. Big concrete doors, thick concrete all around the border, laid down, interlocking piece by piece by piece by piece to form a tunnel underground, and then the dirt covered back in on top of it. So these are the sort of solid reinforcements that the Ukrainians have built up, and this is what the Russians are pushing through successfully. They're not being held up like the Ukrainians were and not making any ground at all. In a matter of weeks, they've claimed a large section of Avdiivka. So with this happening on the battlefield, with the power struggle that is going on, with Zelensky not having elections in 2024 because he knows that he will lose them, with Zelensky in a spin, in a loop around, should he fire Zaluzhny? Oh no, I can't fire Zaluzhny. He's too well liked by the troops and the general public. If I fire him, there'll be blowback and kickback from that. This week, there is reports from one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels that Zelensky sent people to speak to Zelensky and said, Zelensky has lost faith in you, General Zelensky. He wants you to resign. And Zelensky outright rejected it and said, no, I'm not resigning. I've done a good job. I'm not resigning. Now, whether you believe he's done a good job or not, it's a different question. But he has just said no to his commanding officer. So there is a problem there. You can imagine if this was going on in Russia, how this would be all over the media. If Sergei Shoigu or someone had said, or Surovikin had said, Putin, I'm not resigning. Even if you want me to resign, don't care that you don't believe me anymore, not resigning. Anyhow, that's what's happening in Ukraine. Plus, there's talk of Budanov being perhaps another player in looking for the perhaps future presidency. There's a lot of talk of rumours coming from the West that they don't want Zelensky, that Zelensky can't be the person to negotiate with the Russians when negotiations need to happen. Arestovich, an ex-advisor to Zelensky, he is now coming out and playing the complete opposite card. He's now coming out and saying, it's bad. It's really bad. It's all gone tits up for us. We need to get out of this. We need to negotiate. So the leadership in Ukraine is in a bad position and it could crumble and fall apart at any stage. So the US lawmakers, the Republicans are looking at this now and they're aware of this. And they're asking that big question, what is the point of giving $60 billion to these guys? Joe, tell us, why is it such a good idea? Why are we so confident that they're going to do anything good with this? Why do we think after they've had all of this money and been on an offensive through the summertime and did no good at all, and let's be fair about it, the border, the front line didn't move, and now we look at what's happened in a couple of weeks with the Russians pushing back, and we hear that Putin has just signed a decree to increase the size of the Russian military by another 170,000 to up to 1.25 million men. People are starting to ask the questions and go, hang on, this just doesn't make sense. Now, if perhaps Zelensky had been in a powerful, solid position, had made advances, had made it down to the Sea of Azov and cut off Crimea, then I think that funding would be coming. But right now, that they're not in a good position. On the front line, that is the leadership of Ukraine is not in a good position. The front line for Ukraine is not in a good position. And the US is looking at a request for $60 billion to go there. It's just not likely to get approved in a hurry. Now, as I was saying, there's not saying that it will not happen at all, but time is running out. There's another 7 days. Next Friday, the Senate and the House of Representatives in the States, they go on their recess. Now, in theory, they could be called back to debate further, but in reality, next Friday is it. So if an agreement isn't made to come up with and approve this funding by next Friday, then at the very earliest, they will resume, the Congress will come back on the 3rd of January. On the 3rd of January every year, there's a new American Congress is formed. They restart. But if it's anything like 2023, in January of 2023 of this year, then they actually didn't get back and become active until late in January. It was like the 21st or the 23rd of January. So it's another 3 weeks. So you might be 6 weeks away from this funding being debated again and being nutted out and possibly being approved at the end of January. 7 weeks away. In 7 weeks, who knows where the front line will be? Who knows what shape Zelensky and the leadership of Ukraine will be in? And I think it is unlikely that either of those are going to be in a more stable, more positive position. So if there isn't some agreement hammered out in the next week, it's quite likely that come January, when the question is being asked again for funding, it may be just impossible to give that. The Republicans may then be in a position where they go, this isn't going to happen. If we approve this, we ourselves now are going to be tarred with the same brush that you are, Democrats. And we are going to struggle going into the 2024 election, and we don't want that. So we're saying no to this. We'll take the flack for you saying that, we haven't given funding to Ukraine, we'd rather wear that because we think now that the political tide has turned. In the US, the general public is saying, stop giving our tax dollars to these Ukrainians because nothing's happening with it. We can't see why you want to give them another $60 billion. The money itself, just a quick breakdown on what that $60 billion is for. $30 billion will buy arms for Ukraine, and some undisclosed amount of it will be used to replenish US war stocks because the US have given so much to Ukraine. $14.4 billion is needed, supposedly, to support US intelligence and defense support, which means paying for US operations supporting the war, both inside and outside of Ukraine. $16.3 billion is basically cash to keep the Ukrainian government running, paying salaries and pensions. This is a really important part because even if the war effort continues, if men keep fighting, if the money for the administration goes, there will be another bump in the exodus in people leaving Ukraine. Because people who are currently being paid to work to keep the country running, if they stop and lose their funding and their salaries and their wages, then some of them will just give up. And then you will see a larger systemic collapse in Ukraine, which is, again, more likely to pull down the current leadership. And that itself is likely to then impact the governance and leadership of the military and what happens there. And as you can imagine, if you're on the front line fighting for your nation and then you hear that it's all just gone to bits in terms of the leadership and they've been thrown out or replaced or knocked off or whatever it might be, your morale might start to suffer and you might see more people at the front line from Ukraine just going, wait, no, I've had enough of this. There's no point me fighting and me losing my life here when the whole government's in chaos. I might just back out for a while. Can't get much worse, can it? So that is a big part. That $16.3 billion is in some respects, perhaps the most vital. And then there is almost $500 million, $481 million, is to fund Ukrainians who have escaped to the United States. Now, these could have all been separate proposals, but Joe Biden had thought he will bundle them all up together and tie them onto the Israel one, which they thought no one will say no to funding Israel, and then we'll get it through. But that appears now to have backfired. And this is unexpected. And for Zelensky, this is just terrible news. Zelensky actually was scheduled to talk at the emergency meeting, which was held earlier this week between the senators. And he cancelled at the last moment. Now, that itself is just an indication of how things have changed from last year, when Zelensky was the poster boy, when he was invited to speak in front of Congress and Nancy Pelosi and that waved Ukrainian flags behind him, to now he backs out of a Zoom call with senators when they're talking about Ukrainian funding. That's how badly that meeting must have gone. So, has Russia just won the war? Maybe. If the funding doesn't get through this week and it waits another 6 weeks, like I say, it may never come. Now, I'm not saying it won't ever come, but it may never come. It's dodgy now. It's risky. It's on a knife's edge, 50-50 maybe, as to whether Ukraine will get more funding. Now, Ukraine will get more funding. $175 million with an M dollar package has just been announced, which will include some ammunition and some support for Ukraine. And that will be publicised in all the mainstream media that Ukraine's still getting funding. $175 million have gone out. And for the general populace, they will think funding's still going on. They'll have heard a big number, 175 billion. What a lot of people won't recognise is that it's million, it's not billion, it's not the real funding that Ukraine needs. Earlier this week, General Zaluzhny spoke with Lloyd Austin, the US Defence Secretary, and said, this is what we need. We need $400 to $500 billion and 17 million 155 millimeter shells. Now, I watched Alexander Mukuris give a great assessment and commentary on this. And and Alexander said, that really Zelensky is saying this. It's mad. It's madness is what the US and what Lloyd Austin must be thinking. I thought about this and thought, well, perhaps it's something different. Perhaps it's not just outright madness. Perhaps Zelensky has actually done his sums, and in order to push back the Russians to the borders before this conflict started, which is what Zelensky is asking Zelensky to do, maybe this really is what they need. Maybe they need 400 to 500 billion. They need $500 billion and 20 million 155 millimeter shells and a whole bunch of F-16s and F-35s. Maybe that's what they actually do need in order to achieve that goal. Maybe Zelensky isn't just smoking weed and being crazy. Maybe that's what he's saying to Austin is what they would need to be able to achieve that goal. And maybe he's saying that so that Austin has to say, well, we can't do that, so that they can blame the US for the failure. They can go, look, we told you what it really needed. Here's the maths. Here's the Excel spreadsheet that lays out the logic, and you guys can't do it. And you said you'd support us, but you can't do it. Maybe that's what's happening there. Because I can imagine that something like 17 or 20 million shells and $500 million might get the Ukrainian forces on the offensive, on the front foot against the Russians. Of course, they would have to find a whole heap of men to fight, but that's a different question. So that's the situation. Have they lost? Has Ukraine just lost because the US has just pulled funding? Has Russia won? Possibly. It's possible. These things take time. Wars take a little time to wind down. Now, things may change. Who knows? But there are other challenges. Hungary, the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, is requesting or suggesting that Viktor Orban of Hungary, the Prime Minister there, that he stop his vetoes on the EU giving money to Ukraine. So perhaps things like that might happen. But right now, the EU are being held up on giving funding to Ukraine. A number of NATO nations have said they're not giving any more military material to Ukraine. They will support in other ways by investing in infrastructure, in the military industrialized area of Ukraine. However, even on that topic, I've seen that one of the Swedish manufacturers who are going to produce, I think it was the CV90s, they're now pulling out of that because they're saying, well, there's no point us building a factory because there's a good chance the Russians will just bomb it, which seemed obvious at the time when they announced it. But anyhow, so funding for Ukraine is just being stopped, and the fingers are going in the dikes, and it's all stopping and blocking, and in a number of areas, not just the US, but the US is the big one. So, and if we get into the new year and this funding isn't there, like I say, we might just see that Ukraine is just falling apart. The Zelensky may be replaced by someone, and I imagine that they will be replaced by someone who can go and negotiate to the Russians. And the negotiations will be very interesting to see just what shape the Ukrainian borders end up in after those negotiations. Because in a military sense, the Ukrainians have nothing to negotiate with. Now, they may have something else up their sleeve. There may be some negotiations which are in effect between the US directly and Russia, which may see some allowances granted. Perhaps some area of Mykolaiv or Odessa remains Ukrainian. There might be some pathway down there so that they have some access to ports. Those ports would, of course, be controlled by the Russians. Who knows? Interesting to see. So in some other things that are going on, again, I've been talking a little bit about Germany just of late and how they are deindustrializing, how they are suffering from energy costs, how their tyre manufacturers are shutting down thousands of jobs in multiple locations. And all while this is happening in the news today, China's state energy admin has announced that the first fourth-generation nuclear power plant in Shadawan is being developed by the Chinese. This nuclear power plant is a high-temperature, gas-cooled technology, modern nuclear power generator. And interestingly, reportedly 94% of the material for the reactor, that's all of the reactor in its entirety, 94% is domestically sourced or produced. So the Chinese are capable now of developing fourth generation modern gas-cooled high-temperature nuclear reactors, and only 6% of what is needed to make that reactor comes from outside of China. You would imagine, give them another year or two, that will decrease even further, and very soon China will be self-sufficient, domestically capable of producing its own nuclear reactors whenever it wants, with no threat of any components being sanctioned by any nations. And also being capable then of taking that technology and deploying them and offering them to other nations. Saudi Arabia, as example, someone like that, talking to them, or talking to Turkey and saying, Turkey, do you want some of these? Whoever it might be. It looks like they will have the capability to do that without any hindrance of perhaps Western or British or French sanction or dependence upon them for equipment in developing the nuclear power plants. Russian Defense Ministry has just travelled to Niger. The Deputy Minister Yunusbek Yevkrov, he met with Niger's Defence Minister General Salifu Modi. Now, Salifu Modi is part of the government which took power in June 28th, July 28th, after the coup which ousted Mohamed Bazoum. This is Yevkrov's second meeting in 3 months. On his last trip to Africa, he also visited Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger again. They spoke about military technical cooperation, railway network development, and energy, uranium and coal mining. So Niger, previously a French colony, they have, since the coup occurred, they have stopped their export of uranium to France. They were supplying about 20% of France's uranium. Now, France is heavily dependent on uranium. France is the nation on the planet which generates the most of its electricity from nuclear technology, about 70%. So 7 out of every 10 homes in France is powered from nuclear energy. And France is in a tricky position here. There are two other nations, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, that provide uranium, the bulk of the remainder of uranium, to France. After that, I think Australia maybe comes in at about 12%. But Kazakhstan, after Niger stopping exporting its uranium to France, produces or provides about 40% of France's uranium, and Uzbekistan provides another about 20%. So together, collectively, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, about 60% of France's uranium. Now, where they are positioned geographically, Russia actually has control over the export of that uranium to France. So if Russia really wanted to put the thumbscrews on France, they could say, we're not going to allow that uranium to be exported out to you. And Russia could stop their enrichment of uranium, some of which ends up in France. French President Macron has just this week travelled to Kazakhstan in an attempt to strengthen relationships there so as to secure that energy supply, that uranium supply to France. Because if they were to lose that for some reason, then France is in real troubles, real problems. They would then need to go looking to other nations. They would probably turn to Australia to get more of Australia's yellow cake uranium and then find somewhere to enrich it. But these things take time and they cost a lot of money because you're establishing new networks, new supply lines, not using the traditional contracts you've already got. Anyhow, so as France is losing its grip over Niger, Russian and Iranian foreign ministers and that are traveling to Niger and strengthening relationships. They're looking at investing in infrastructure and energy sector, and no doubt looking to purchase uranium from Niger, not only for their own needs, but also so as to restrict and lock down the ability of perhaps France to be able to get that uranium again. Advancements in Russian fighter technology too. So the United Aircraft Corporation has reportedly patented modular modifications to the Su-75. The Su-75 fighter, which is known as the Checkmate, has a patent secured which addresses the ability to allow for the cockpit to be swapped out in 3 modes. 1, a single seat, single pilot mode. 2, a double seat mode. That may perhaps be for training purposes or for particular missions where you need your pilot to be focused on the flying and perhaps a weapons specialist behind the pilot who's focusing on the targeting, that type of thing. But more interestingly is a third mode. And the third mode is an unmanned module. So what the Russians have effectively done here is patented these Su-75s are in development. The first ones of them are expected out in 2024. 300 of them planned to be produced over the next 15 years. Although if they are successful in this new mode, then we may see more of that. But what the Russians have effectively done here has turned these Su-75s into unmanned drones. So as we spoke on the show a week or so ago about the termites, the new miniature helicopters which the Russians are developing, which can fire 3 laser-guided missiles each. They're only 450 kilograms, or about a quarter or a third of the size of a helicopter. And importantly, they're reusable. They can fly back after they've launched their missiles. They don't require a pilot, which means they don't require the years of training and cost for a pilot. Instead of a helicopter pilot and things like the Mi-28s and the Ka-52s and the Blackhawks, those attack helicopters are considered to be the most challenging to fly and for a pilot to learn. They take years before you can fly them. Now, you can have a drone operator. You can have a 16-year-old kid. You can have me with a couple of hours of training flying one of these termite helicopters. And it looks like very soon, similar approach being taken to fighter jets. Just a little bit of their capability. The head of Rostec in an interview with the Wall Street Journal has said the Su-75 will carry more than 7 tons of air-to-air and air-to-surface armaments and will be capable of striking several targets at a time. They have a max speed of Mach 1.8, so they're not slow, and a range of 3,000 kilometres. So a range of 3,000 kilometres for one of these would get one of them from the Caspian Sea to Israel and back again, just as an indication. I think it'd be about that far. They are being developed for domestic markets, of course, and I imagine the domestic market will be using this drone-capable version, but also for foreign sales, and those export markets are primarily thought to be, at this time, most likely to be Argentina, India, Vietnam, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Nigeria. So, speaking of the United Arab Emirates, Russian President Vladimir Putin has just conducted a lightning strike one-day visit to the Middle East. Reportedly, his jet was accompanied by 4 fighters who flew to secure his trip there. He met with UAE leaders and Saudi leaders. The welcome he has been given in the United Arab Emirates is something worth watching. Weeb Union on YouTube. Check out Weeb's channel. His latest video has got a good video of this, but you'll be able to find it on other social media. But there's a 21-gun salute. There are horses and camels down a massive driveway. There are people praying and chanting. He's driven up to the palace, and all while that is happening, there is a group of fighter jets flying through the sky, trailing the red, white and blue, basically making a massive Russian flag flying in a circle around while these proceedings are going on. Sheikh Mohammed said, "I'm happy to meet you again." And Putin said, "Our relations, largely due to your position, have reached an unprecedentingly high level. The UAE is Russia's main trading partner in the Arab world." He then, after that, although the leaders in the UAE, they talked about bilateral cooperation in the energy industry and advanced technologies. Advanced technologies, I imagine, are things like Su-75s with autonomous flight capability, termite helicopters with autonomous flight capability. Perhaps chatting about, interesting what Xi is doing with those new gas-cooled nuclear power plants. You guys might be interested in getting something from China in the future. We could perhaps help and broker that deal with you, for you. All of these sort of things are on the table now. He then met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, and one of the comments there was that nothing can prevent the development of our friendly relations. Putin then, so after flying back, then earlier today, or just yesterday, by the time you're probably seeing this, he hosted the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, in Moscow. So you can see here that Putin is making big efforts in the Middle East. And unlike US diplomats like Secretary of State Tony Blinken and German foreign ministers who are being left standing at the top of the stairs of their plane with no one of their equivalent turning up to the airport to meet them, or Tony Blinken when he was in Saudi Arabia being made to wait all night, reportedly. A meeting scheduled for in the evening, waiting. Next morning, "Oh yeah, I'll turn up now and meet with you." Very showing disrespect, great disrespect, as opposed to what we're seeing for Russian President Putin and the way that he's being greeted. In the photographs that you see with him meeting President Ebrahim Raisi, Iranian president, where he says, "Please give my good wishes to the Ayatollah," you can see Putin coming in to shake hands with a grin on his face. He is happy to see him. They're happy to see each other. This isn't a cold wooden handshake at a distance. This is like a couple of bros slapping a high five and giving one another a hug. So this contrasts the relationship that Russia holds in the Middle Eastern area, in the Arab states, versus what the US is trying to cling on to. The US must be concerned about this when they're seeing this. Like these meetings and handshakes and the greetings themselves say so much about what is going on and the changing face of power in the US and who the Arab nations are looking to align themselves with. On top of this, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be traveling on this weekend to the United Arab Emirates. So following Putin, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister, will be going there to continue discussions. Lavrov has just actually been in Skopje in Northern Macedonia, where he attended international security talks. He blamed the war returning to Europe on NATO's reckless expansion to the east. As expected, the NATO nations there said that he was being ridiculous. This was all Russia's fault. Russia has to take its own responsibility for getting into this. Russia caused the whole conflict. Lavrov eventually ended up leaving, apparently walking out of some of the meetings. One last thing that I'll just talk a little bit about. Interesting news. Venezuela. So President Nicolas Maduro has declared the Essequibo, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly because I'm not a Spanish speaker, so apologies if that's not right, and I will improve that if it's not. Essequibo province of neighboring country Guyana as part of Venezuela. Now I'm just going to go to the map here for a minute So on this map here, hopefully you can see that okay. This is the border of Venezuela up here, and this is Guyana in here. Now, about 2/3 of Guyana are the Essequibo province. Now, what's caused this conflict? This has been going on for a long while. In 1899 in Paris, there was an arbitration panel that said, actually, this area, Essequibo, is part of Guyana. It's no longer part of Venezuela. However, the region had been within the boundaries of Venezuela when Venezuela was under Spanish colonial control. So over the last few decades, there has been a lot of talk in Venezuela that actually that's our land and we'd like it back. President Maduro of Venezuela held a referendum this week, and the people of Venezuela have voted to not agree with an international ruling that this should remain as Guyana, and it seems to be in response to the fact that oil has recently been confirmed as being in some of these areas of Essequibo, and Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, in April of this year began to auction off oil rights for some of these oil deposits. Now, Maduro, I think, is saying, well, hang on, we think that's our land anyhow. We really don't like the idea of you auctioning off what we believe is ours. And so we are going to claim that province. So he's held a referendum, got the backing of the people in his country, so he can, not like he's just riding off and doing it on his own. He can say, look, I had a referendum, the people of Venezuela believe this is our land, we should do this. So the US has now announced flight drills over Guyana and its unwavering support. The US and Venezuela have not been on great relations for some time. There has been sanctions, US sanctions against Venezuela, freezing their funds overseas and primarily sanctioning American companies from dealing with the energy and oil industry in Venezuela and stopping the export of oil from Venezuela to America and other nations. The US does not like Maduro as a leader, doesn't really recognize the 2018 elections, and has looked to topple him and oust him. However, due to the conflict in Ukraine last year, the US started to relax some of these sanctions against Venezuela around oil. Because Russian oil is no longer easily available to Europe, the US have started to look or need to look to other sources of oil and energy. And so in Venezuela, they said, okay, now we don't want to stop we don't want to block your oil. We might buy some of your oil now, or allow other people to buy your oil because that's okay now because we really need the oil now. So this seems to be what's happening here. And even with these sanctions in place, which was there again to try to weaken Maduro, it looks as though he has strengthened his position in the last year or so. China has just announced that it is upgrading its diplomatic ties to Venezuela, and Maduro has announced that Venezuela would like to join BRICS. So the US oil sanctions are losing power over Venezuela, as now Venezuela looks to join BRICS, and no doubt look to sell oil to BRICS nations in its own currency or in that BRICS nations' currency. We're seeing more and more of that happening, which takes away the sanctioning power of the US dollar. Guyana's Attorney General has, though, just yesterday said that the UN Security Council may be contacted over this, and if the referendum for Venezuela to take the Essequibo area as part of Venezuela, and Venezuela is moving military to the border. I think I may have seen reports too that Brazil is also moving military towards the border. I'll look further into that, but that's interesting too. That the UN Security Council if they decided so, member nations could be required to lend military aid to Guyana. Now, interestingly, the permanent members of the UN Security Council are China and Russia, the United Kingdom, the United States, and France. There are a number of non-permanent members such as Albania, Brazil, Ecuador, Gabon, Ghana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, and the United Arab Emirates. So you can start to see that if Guyana does go to the UN Security Council and they wish to ask for military assistance, that there are a number of nations there who are likely to veto that. China being one, Russia being one, the United Arab Emirates perhaps being another. So Guyana may find itself in a position where it can't get the military support that it wants. And so this makes you wonder, why is Maduro, why are Venezuela doing this now? Now, obviously, part of the reason will be the fact that Guyana, that Georgetown, is beginning to auction off oil rights, and Venezuela doesn't want that to happen. They want to own that land and can keep those oil rights for themselves. But also, maybe with the US engaged in a conflict with Russia in Ukraine, now engaged in another conflict in the Middle East, assisting Israel in its conflict with Gaza, and that itself could escalate at any stage into a major conflict. Maybe Maduro's thinking, well, now's the best shot I've got. The US are busy over there. I'm seeing fractures and ruptures in institutions like the UN and the EU. So maybe now I take this section, the Essequibo area of Guyana, and if Guyana says to the UN Security Council, hey, we want some military support, well, they are pretty confident that the UAE and China and Russia will probably veto that. Maybe. Who knows? I think I'll leave it there. I might do another one of these tomorrow, and I'll do like with a weekly summary on Ukraine, a bit of more of the battlefront in Ukraine. But this has been a really interesting week. There's so much going on at the moment. I thought it would be good to get one of these out. Hey, look, thank you if you watched this far. I hope you're enjoying the channel, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And I hope you have a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you soon.